Hello and welcome to the France 24 interview. Our guest today is Lord Chris Patten. He was the 28th and last British governor of Hong Kong from 1992 to 1997, the date of the handover to China. He was then chairman of the Conservative Party and he was also European Commissioner for External Relations. He's now Chancellor of the University of Oxford. Thank you very much, Lord Patten, for being with us.
Pleased to be here. I watch you quite often, so it's nice to be on the show.
Thank you. I want to talk obviously about Hong Kong. We saw last week leading activists Joshua Wong, Agnes Chow being sentenced to jail for protesting outside a police station. Last month, we saw 4 MPs disqualified, others resigned in protest. Since Beijing pushed through a drastic national security law back in June, it seems that the one country, two system formula enshrined in the 1984 Chinese-British Joint Declaration, which was supposed to guarantee Hong Kong's liberal democratic way until 2047, is now officially buried.
Yeah, the Communist Party, which you can't trust further than you can spit, has certainly broken its word yet again, as it has on other things. For example, the international health regulations in response to the coronavirus. It's broken its word in a treaty lodged at the United Nations. And it's been part of a pattern of behavior by Beijing, by Xi Jinping's Chinese communist regime, which I think concerns the whole world. Sometimes coercive commercial diplomacy, border rows with India, threats to Taiwan, breaking its word with naval maneuvers in the South China Sea and so on. It's a pattern of behavior which I'm afraid has had as its most formidable victim Hong Kong, which was a great international free city with a very vibrant French community there, among others. And Hong Kong's been put into handcuffs by the Chinese regime with the national security law, with arrests of people who express dissent, and with a general sense of fear engendered by the fact that the Chinese security, the Chinese equivalent of the KGB, is in effect in place in Hong Kong, and you're now seeing in Hong Kong threats even to the independence of the judiciary. So it's very, very worrying.
Why now? I mean, some are saying that it's due to the security law, which followed a wave of protests, unprecedented, in terms of numbers and so on. Others are saying that this has been essentially a stealth coup, long in the making. What's your analysis?
Well, I think it goes back to the arrival of Xi Jinping as the lifetime dictator in Beijing. And he came in at a time when I think the Chinese Communist Party was starting to worry about whether globalization, urbanization, changes in the internet, and in some senses the prosperity of parts of the middle class were going to make it more difficult for the communists to keep their tight grip on everything that happens in China. And I think that they decided that the real threat to their leadership was posed by the things we would associate with open societies and liberal democracy, from independent judiciary, rule of law, proper teaching in schools rather than so-called patriotic education, freedom of speech, and all those sort of things. And they decided, I think, that liberal democracy was a real threat. Indeed, they said that in a famous document that they produced when about the time that Xi Jinping became the dictator. And I think they saw Hong Kong in many respects as a symbol of all those things which they hated and thought were a threat to Chinese communism. It's not an argument between China and Hong Kong. It's an argument between the Chinese Communist Party and the aspirations for Chinese citizenship incorporating the rule of law, which I think the majority of people felt in Hong Kong. In Hong Kong, people were told that to love China, they had to love the Communist Party, and they can't swallow that.
Right, but it seems the Western world is quite silent. The British government, for one, other European governments, with maybe the exception lately of the Trump administration. We've seen sanctions between China, the US, including visa restrictions on US official travel to Hong Kong. Is it just because it's big business, or is it maybe a moral failure?
No, I don't think that's true. Only recently, I think 39 countries, including, of course, the United Kingdom, raised their concerns about Hong Kong as well as Xinjiang and Tibet at the UN. I think there have been many countries which have expressed their outrage at what's been happening. There's an interparliamentary group of legislators who've, in recently 155 of them from right around the world, expressed their concerns about what's been happening in Hong Kong. In Britain, of course, we've promised passports leading to, in the future, full citizenship to people who have the right to have a British national overseas passport in Hong Kong. So I don't think you can say that there's been no concern expressed. Indeed, the Chinese keep on stamping their feet about other countries expressing their worries about what's happening in Hong Kong. And I think what we have to realize, if I may say so, in Europe, because whatever happens in these wretched Brexit talks, Britain remains a part of Europe. We can't suddenly change geography or change what is our long-term national interest. Everybody in Europe should recognize everybody in liberal democracies around the world, Canada, the United States, Australia, New Zealand, that if China gets away with loutish behavior, if it gets away with bullying and undermining liberal democracies, we'll all suffer. We don't want a Cold War with China, but we should recognize that China wants to undermine our own freedoms and our own values, and we have to stand up for ourselves. I think that's recognized by the French government, which has expressed concerns. Only recently, for example, the French government, in relation to the bullying of Australia by China, expressed its concern, as did many others. So I think we really have to call China out on the abysmal behavior and that they've been showing, and make clear to them that they can't get away any longer with the sort of bullying which they've tried over decades now in order to get us to accept their narrative.
Right. Is what's unfolding in Hong Kong, essentially China taking control and pushing aside what it doesn't like, a rehearsal for Taiwan?
Well, that is obviously a worry. I don't think that even this dreadful regime in Beijing could be so mad as to risk a war with Taiwan. But they're certainly making lots of militaristic and threatening gestures. Taiwan, like Hong Kong, will not accept that in order to prove that you love China, you have to love the Chinese Communist Party. Look, in Hong Kong, to take an example, more than 2/3 of the population are themselves refugees or the family of refugees from the events of modern Chinese history, from the Great Leap Forward, from the Cultural Revolution, from the beastly brutality which the Chinese communist regime has so often shown. I think it was getting better in the 1990s and early 2000s, despite Tiananmen Square in '89. I think it was starting to improve and to open things up, but I think they're terrified that if they do that, they can't continue to keep a grip. You know, a few years ago, one of the Chinese leaders expressed his concern that, having read Tocqueville's Ancien Régime and the French Revolution, that China was in danger of going the same way. He argued that just because people were getting better off, as it happened in the 18th century and was now happening in China, didn't make it easier to govern them. And above all, he noticed that the monarchy in France had fallen in the 1790s because it had started to try to reform in the years before, and that authoritarian regimes are always at their weakest or at their most vulnerable when they try to open up the system. And I think that's why the Chinese have closed down. And I'm afraid that Hong Kong is a victim of that.
Right. Do you regret not doing more before the handover in 1997 to push or establish, I would say, democratic values in Hong Kong? In retrospect, you were maybe confident. You mentioned the 90s as an area where China would go towards democracy. Was this a mistake, maybe, to believe that?
No, we did a great deal. I mean, when I was there for 5 years, we did a great deal to try to sustain the international rule of law. We set up or got agreement for a Supreme Court, which would include foreign judges, which is still there. We did a great deal to clean up the human rights situation, and we made sure that the international Covenant on Civil and Political Rights was put into the Constitution. That's something that China is now completely overruling. We asserted the importance of the separation of powers between the legislature, the executive, and the judiciary, which the Chinese Communist Party is now denying was ever part of Hong Kong's treaty. And we at least put in place arrangements for democracy, which pointed the way to full democracy. It at least gave Hong Kong an accountable system of government, which was clean as well as being pretty effective. And the communists themselves, the Chinese themselves, promised that they would allow Hong Kong in due course after 1997 to decide for itself how the legislature was chosen. They've, of course, rode back on that. You can't trust them. So China likes to actually shift the playing field in its own direction.
Right. Just the last question. I mentioned you were head of the Conservative Party. You were also EU commissioner. You vividly opposed Brexit. This is going down the wire. What's your reading of the situation?
I'm as puzzled as you are at how it is that we have a government allegedly conservative, which seems to be intent on turning its back on our biggest trade partner, a trade partner which we've helped to create. It was Margaret Thatcher who was the main proponent of the single market, and has done so while constantly being in a state of mendacity and self-delusion. So I'm worried about it. But if it happens, as I fear it may, I obviously want Britain to do as well as possible in very difficult circumstances. None of us wants ill of our country, and you can bet your bottom dollar that when things do go wrong, people like me, people who wanted to stay in the European Union, will be blamed. And if we point out that they're going wrong, we'll be accused of being traitors and supporting other countries. It's a very poisonous atmosphere created by all this, and it's not helped by the personality of our Prime Minister.
Who you would describe as?
I would describe as not somebody that you would want to trust very far.
Lord Patten, I want to thank you very much for your time and for appearing on the France 24 interview, and thank you for watching it.